As I'm recording this, the coronavirus continues to spread throughout China. It's not really clear yet just how bad this is going to be. This could range from having 100,000 infected, a couple thousand people dead, to a global pandemic, to the collapse of the Chinese state, to a vaccine being developed in a couple months and it largely going away. But as I'm watching some of the stuff come out of China, the inability to feed people in the quarantine zone, how the army doesn't seem to be able to um, maintain an effective quarantine, how they're trying to put like areas that are larger than Canada in terms of population under isolation. Like, and I was just kind of watching things falling apart there. It, to me at least, really puts a big question mark over the future. Even if the Chinese state doesn't collapse, this is going to do immense economic damage. I mean, the whole economy of China is basically shutting down for a couple months, and there's like just total economic and social chaos going on over there. Who knows? This could set China back years. This could, we don't even know what the effects on the global economy would be because so much of the global economy is based on cheap manufactured imports from China. And I mean, like, there's all kinds of dominoes. Countries, if the disruptions in China go on long enough, maybe countries will start bringing their manufacturing bases back. And then when China gets its up and running again, maybe people say, "Oh, it's too risky to invest in China," or "Oh, we have it back in our home country. Let's not worry about shipping it back overseas again." I mean, who knows? More people might die from a famine as like the food transportation is broken down and they're having to supply cities and like provinces of tens of millions of people who no one wants to go into because of the virus. So I'm not saying China's going to collapse or it's the end of China as a rising power or anything like that. I'm just saying it puts to me a question mark over the sense of inevitability we've had for the last 20 years or so. There's been kind of this idea since 2000 that China was the rising star, that the great dragon would rise and unfurl its wings and tail across the entirety of the world, and the eagle would retreat and, I don't know, go sit on its eggs or something. But there was this idea that America was the declining star, Russia was the declining star, well, the star that had already fallen to the earth, and China was going to be the new global superpower. China was going to be the maintainer of order, was going to be the center of world government. And to me, there's kind of a question mark over that. China has immense structural problems, massive like internal debt. Like you have these huge ghost cities, you have extreme corruption, you have an economy that's entirely based on exports, you have a rapidly aging population, you have a system of hygiene and food preparation that lends itself to the creation of super viruses. You have all this stuff that could potentially explode at any given time. And there's stuff like this, obviously, in the United States and other countries, but not nearly to the same extent. I don't think there's the same amount of instability, particularly when it comes to things like viruses and food. And it could only take a couple of these to not put China down for the count, but really to kind of knock it off its pedestal as being the next great power. So I mean, let's think about this for a minute. So let's say the United States continues to decline, as we're all pretty sure it will, from a combination of things: debt, the implementation of single party rule, all kind of the degenerative social factors, and the U.S. just kind of continues to decline. Its military, despite its immense budget, eventually becomes ineffective, and it's no longer able to project power beyond its shores. What happens then? Is there going to be another global leader? I mean, people like to say Russia, but Russia has a lot of the same issues as China. It has a very aging population. A lot of its military, despite recent modernization, is very old. It doesn't have the population and strength it did as the Soviet Union. And maybe it can kind of reconstitute itself, but I think it's going to be a long time before it can attempt to do what it did during the Cold War again. You have Europe, which is also a complete and utter mess. Some countries like France at this point look like they're going to collapse at some point in the foreseeable future. And I don't say that to be like an alarmist. I mean, if there's any countries in Europe that are actually going to collapse, Like in the case of France, you had the yellow vests, and it got so bad there was a complete media blackout about it. In North America, like they refused to report on it. I saw like no news on it. Even within Europe, it looked like they were mass censoring, and they had to call in like the European army to like put it down. And I think the protests are still going on as of me recording this. But you have the UK that just left. It looks like Italy might leave. There's always Grexit. There's a lot of people in France who want to leave. The EU seems to be having trouble. So is the EU going to be the next superpower? Probably not. Russia will is and will continue to be a great power. China, I don't think has it in it in terms of just any number of things to be a great power. Sorry, to be a superpower. So what is the world with no superpower going to look like? Because it's been a very long time since we've been in this situation. Like because we had Spain, we had Britain, we had France, we had the United States. We've often had one or two major powers that were able to basically hold the rest of the world in thrall. And I mean, if you look about it, the post World War II order, as it were, is largely dependent upon America. Things like the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations. Most of these international organizations only exist because America made them or America enforces their decisions. If the United States was to go away, if they weren't able to use coercive or military power to kind of force everybody to play by the same rule book, then will the countries continue to abide by the rules? Like you might get into a tragedy of a common situation or like a prisoner's dilemma situation where it would be in everyone's best interest to cooperate, but nobody trusts each other. So everybody just kind of strikes out for themselves and it makes the situation worse for everybody, but it's worse for people who try to continue to cooperate. Under the current system, America just says there is no prisoner's dilemma. You're all going to do what I say and you're all going to cooperate. And when that goes away, like what's going to happen? A lot of the global economy, such as like freedom of the seas, piracy, um, a lot of things to do with trade are kind of explicitly or implicitly backed by the US. Like if pirates show up, they'll eventually go and do something about it. If there's a regime or something else that's going to destabilize the global economy, they'll normally go and try to deal with it. And like what happens once that's not there anymore? When everybody kind of wakes up and they notice, oh, daddy's not watching us anymore, there's not this big boot that's going to come down if we get out of line. And I think it's not, I think there's a lot of naivete about what that world will look like. I think a lot of people are saying, oh, Russia's based, China's based. Once everything is America's fault, the eternal Anglo, the eternal burger. Once the United States collapses, things are going to go back to how they were beforehand. America is the great spreader of social liberalism. America is the great spreader of degeneracy. Once it's gone, you won't have these issues anymore. And on a certain degree, I understand that America's definitely used its diplomatic, military, and economic power to force some pretty horrendous things on countries throughout the world. I'm not going to deny that. But are the alternatives really that much better? I mean, if you look at how much damage the Soviet Union did to Western Christianity, in particular the Catholic Church, through like mass infiltration, through stuff like liberation theology destroyed Catholicism in Latin America. It's like dead there. What's left of it is this weird mixture of pseudo Catholicism with like paganism and Marxism and stuff like that. China also, people are like, oh, China's base, China's red pill, China's race realist. The Chinese are willing to play the race card whenever they need it. They're willing to play off like African. They're willing to say, "Oh, Africa's this post-colonial thing. Oh, the Western countries have to allow in African immigrants." That kind of thing. They have to pay reparations to Africa. Are you going to allow them to move to China? No, hell no. We don't want them here. And they're very willing to play a victim. And whatever things we like might agree with China on, they're just things we incidentally agree with China. because the Chinese are just kind of naturally xenophobic, and there's just some other things that a certain proportion of the population don't like. So the government has to pander to that. But I don't think there's necessarily anything deeper under there. We can talk about like the resurgence of Orthodox Christianity or whatever in Russia, but they're still allied with people like Cuba and Venezuela and a lot of other countries that are like just as degenerate as any supposed American ally is. So I think if like people are thinking, oh, China's going to come and save us once those evil Yanks are gone, we're going to have like based neo Taiping China and like the based restored Russian Empire, and they're going to drive out liberalism from the globe forever. I think you're mistaken, and I think you may find that things get worse before they get better. And in America's defense, they have a very thankless, difficult job. Trying to be the guarantor of some sort of global world order, trying to kind of single handedly keep things running, keep the ships going, keep the like large scale wars from breaking out, and juggling all of this. It's kind of inevitable that most people are not going to be happy because isn't that kind of what a compromise is where nobody's really happy? And they have to kind of play off their own interests against geopolitical stability. There's also just a general, I don't know if lackadaisical or ennui with America, where they like the people have become kind of so lazy they can't like during Iraq they lost like at least by when I stopped taking count like a couple thousand people and they're like oh the casualties are too much, we can't deal with it. We can't deal with a war where a couple thousand people die. If more than like five people die, we have to admit defeat and leave. I'm not saying the Iraq war is justified. I'm just saying that was used as the like that this was some like unprecedented level of sacrifice in Iraq, and that was the reason that the US should have pulled out. So once again, we kind of come back to the question: when America finally like bites the dust or just becomes too corrupt or are in debt or whatever and isn't able to function as the guarantor of global order anymore, what are we left with? We could have regional alliances. We could have kind of a situation you had in the 19th century where a group of great powers start to begin really dangerous games for control over different regions of the world. And rather than like a bipolar or a monopolar world, you'll have a multipolar world where you'll have like Russia, China, maybe India, Brazil, the United States, and whatever's left, and like Turkey and all these other countries, and they'll be trying to grab up parts of the world because there won't be anything kind of to hold them in check anymore. There won't be kind of this consensus that we try not to invade other countries and redraw the borders as much as we maybe could. One thing, though, that I think if America ceases to be the guarantor of global order, I think globalism is largely finished at that point in time. Because the amount the United States has kind of done to standardize the like international trade, the international monetary system, international diplomacy, all of these institutions, if they don't have the American army and the American dollar backing them anymore, I think all of this stuff basically falls apart almost overnight. And while a lot of us would like to see globalism die off, I think in the short term it's going to not be very pleasant because the global economy is very much dependent upon different countries exporting different things to other parts of the world. And there's a lot of specialization. And in a lot of cases, that's been a good thing. It's allowed countries that are better at some things to more efficiently produce them and obviously trade with countries that are better at doing other things. Like in Canada, we can't really produce tropical fruit. So we trade, I don't know, oil or coal or something to countries that produce tropical fruit. We can't grow tea here either, so we trade cattle to China or India or whoever in exchange for tea. So like what happens is a lot of these will probably continue as like bilateral trade agreements, but we won't have like this idea where every country should treat every country the same way. This idea of having like a common set of international business standards, kind of a common set of like rules of the road, as it were. And I think that's going to be a very difficult world to live in and a very difficult world to adjust to. And I think once it's gone, we're going to kind of take a look back and see how much we kind of owed the US. And once again, I'm not saying the world won't necessarily be better in some ways, but I think once again, it's a grass is greener thing. We're all angry at America for its failures and for things that we think it did poorly. But we don't really see what would have happened if the Soviets had have won the Cold War or the Chinese would become the world's like the superpower and what kind of the alternative would be. And if we see the alternative, maybe we'll come to appreciate America a bit more and kind of understand the decisions it made and maybe the shortcomings of them a bit better. Anyways, I know that was long, rambly, and maybe didn't really get my point across, but it is what it is. Nothing I can do, but I digress. This is